At age 75, Julius Erving is still spoken of as one of the people who forever changed the way America looks at basketball. He didn't just win titles, he redefined the beauty of the sport. Before dunks became routine, it was Erving who turned the air above the court into a stage, turned motion into art, turned power into grace. From the ABA to the NBA, he was the bridge between street basketball and professional basketball, between instinct and discipline. 2 ABA championships, 1 NBA title with Philadelphia, an MVP award, dozens of all-star appearances, a retired jersey. All of these are merely the outer markers of a much deeper legacy. Later generations, from Michael Jordan to Kobe Bryant, didn't just learn from Erving the art of flying through the air, they learned how to carry dignity in victory. To the American public, Dr. J wasn't the loudest, but he was the one who made people believe that greatness could come with elegance, that power didn't have to scream. In the collective memory, he remains forever the image of a purer era of basketball, where talent, discipline and dedication became one. But behind those immortal clips lies another reality, where achievement doesn't equal peace, and the spotlight doesn't cover the price paid. The body that once soared carries the marks of every landing, every grueling season, every year when willpower outlasted physical strength. The pain doesn't need to be narrated because it's present in every slowed movement, in every limitation he has to accept as part of life. And deeper still is the pain that no training can overcome: private losses, family voids, moments of helplessness that fame could not rescue. Julius Erving didn't fight time with anger, nor did he deny it with nostalgia. He chose endurance, quietly adjusting to the new reality, carrying memories of what was lost without turning them into complaints. His will no longer shows in leaps, but in the ability to keep living with what will never heal, a life celebrated but not cured. And it is precisely in that quiet, persistent endurance that Dr. J reveals another kind of greatness, less visible but far more profound, the greatness of a man who paid the full price for the legend the world loves. If you want to go deeper into the story behind the legend of Julius Erving, where the spotlight no longer hides the silent wounds, please subscribe to join us for the next parts. Roosevelt, New York, in the years when Julius Erving was still a child, was not a place that nurtured dreams. It was a place that taught people how to endure. It was a typical post-war American working-class town, where every morning began with the sound of iron gates opening, hurried footsteps heading to factories, men's faces already carrying exhaustion before the workday started, and women learning how to hold everything together so the family wouldn't collapse. In that setting, Julius Erving grew up not with encouragement or dreams spoken aloud, but with a very early sense that life was a series of days you had to get through on your own. When his father died too soon, that loss didn't just take away a person, it took away the emotional pillar a child needs to feel protected. There was no full goodbye, no complete explanation, no one sitting down to tell the boy Julius that this pain would eventually ease. It simply happened. Like so many losses in working-class American life back then, silent, swift, and leaving a void no one had time to fill. At home, his mother had to keep going, keep working, keep carrying the load. Love didn't disappear, but it became frugal, restrained, expressed more through duty than words. Julius learned very early that crying didn't bring anything back, that asking why didn't bring his father home, and that showing weakness only added to the burden on the adults around him. No one taught him how to grieve, so he learned to swallow the pain, treating silence as a survival reflex. In Roosevelt, kids weren't allowed to be too fragile. They learned to get up when they fell, brush the dirt off their clothes themselves, and keep walking without looking back. Julius was no different, but in him, that silence wasn't just a habit, it gradually became identity. He didn't seek attention, didn't demand comfort, wasn't used to leaning on anyone. His father's death taught him a brutal but lasting lesson: the people you love can vanish without warning, and if you want to keep living, you have to learn to stand on your own even when no one is holding your hand. No one explained to him that pain should be shared, so Julius explained to himself that strength meant needing no one. In the gray streets of Roosevelt, where working-class life left its mark on every house, that boy began to form a closed inner world, where emotions were tightly controlled like a luxury not to be wasted. Basketball wasn't yet a light, it was a refuge. On the court he could run, jump, breathe hard, and let his body speak for things that had no words. There, no one asked what he was thinking, no one waited for him to explain his sadness. Every leap, every moment hanging in the air, was a brief escape from the feeling of being left behind by life. But even when he found that refuge, Julius still carried the old lesson: don't need anyone too much. The absence of his father didn't make him rebel or push him into loud mistakes. It sharpened him into a child who learned too early how to suppress himself. Deep down, he didn't believe the world was built to catch him when he fell, so he chose not to fall in front of anyone. It was in that context that the seed of the man later honored by all of America was planted, not by hope, but by absence, not by support, but by emptiness. A seed that grew slowly, quietly, carrying within it the strength of discipline, but also the inherent loneliness of someone who learned to live without daring to need anyone, because he had lost the most important thing too soon. As the years passed in Roosevelt, Julius Erving gradually understood that in his world, weakness was not a safe choice. That boy wasn't the kind of kid called on in class, wasn't someone teachers or adults paid special attention to, and certainly wasn't the center of comforting arms. Julius was present, but quietly, like a shadow learning to walk close to the wall so as not to get in anyone's way. There were no words of encouragement when he was sad, no one asked what he was thinking, and there was no space for him to try expressing emotions without fear of becoming a burden. After his father's death, he soon realized that attention was a luxury, and comfort was not something to expect. So instead of seeking it, Julius learned to live without it, like a survival skill. He watched the adults around him, the tired faces after work, the calloused hands from labor, and understood that in this world, everyone was holding it together. No one had extra room for a child's sadness, so Julius taught himself a simple but harsh lesson: don't let anyone see you fall, don't demand, don't need too much. When emotions rose, he swallowed them down, as he had long been used to doing. In that silence, basketball appeared not as a dream, but as a rare space where he wasn't judged for not speaking, not smiling, not explaining. On the court, no one required him to talk about his pain. The ball didn't ask what he had lost, and the rim didn't judge who he was. There was only movement, breathing, and absolute focus on the moment. Julius didn't play for applause, because he wasn't used to being acknowledged. He played because it was the only place that allowed him to exist, without having to prove anything beyond continuing to move. Every full-speed run, every jump was a way to escape the silent rooms, the long evenings where the feeling of abandonment crept into every thought. When his body left the ground, even for a brief moment, Julius felt lighter, as if life's heaviness could be left below. But the joy, if there was any, wasn't something he allowed himself to hold on to for long. Even in those soaring moments, he kept a distance from his emotions, as if afraid that if he let go too much, the pain would return stronger. Basketball became a repeated ritual, where he released energy, released silence, released wordless questions, then returned to the familiar closed state. Julius didn't learn to play in the carefree way of children. He learned to control himself, learned to let his body work in place of his heart, and learned to let performance speak for his feelings. Every jump wasn't just an athletic act. It was a quiet declaration that he was still here, still existing, even if no one noticed. In that process, Julius's personality gradually took shape, not from taught moral lessons, but from the repetition of self-restraint. He became calmer than his age, less reactive, and always kept a safe distance from others. Emotions didn't disappear, but they were locked away carefully and orderly, like fragile things stored in the deepest drawer. Julius grew up believing that if he was disciplined enough, focused enough, good enough, he wouldn't need anyone to hold him up. That belief both helped him survive and laid the foundation for a long-term tragedy: a person accustomed to carrying everything alone, but unaccustomed to being loved fully. When others saw in Julius a talent blossoming, they didn't see the boy using every practice, every shot, every run to escape the feeling that he wasn't important enough to be kept. Basketball gave him an escape, but it also reinforced a dangerous habit: treating not needing anyone as strength. It was from here that the shape of the man later called Dr. By all of America, began to become clearer, not just through natural talent, but through an inner world trained to endure, to not complain, and to keep moving forward, without ever allowing himself to pause long enough to ask whether anyone was willing to walk with him. When Julius Erving stepped into the world of professional basketball, it wasn't through the main gate of American sports power, but through a side path called the ABA. To many people, the ABA was just an alternative league, an experimental stage that was never considered the center. But for Julius, it was the only place ready to open its doors to the person he was becoming. There, he was allowed to fly. No one demanded that he keep his feet on the ground. No one forced him to restrain his instincts. Julius soared higher than anyone ever had before, not just literally with leaps that cleared opponents' hands, but symbolically, with a style of play that shattered every old mold. On those ABA courts, he turned the air into a space for creation, turned every offensive play into an artistic moment. The crowd rose to its feet, cheers crashing down like waves, and in those moments, Julius was no longer the silent boy from Roosevelt. He was the center of attention, the reason people came to the arena. But even amid those roaring ovations, a quiet paradox began to form, because no matter how high he flew, Julius knew he was flying in a sky that many people didn't bother to look up at. The ABA could love him, but the mainstream basketball establishment never fully accepted it as complete validation. Every title, every MVP award, every time he was hailed as the symbol of that league carried an unspoken question: did any of this really count? Julius felt that feeling very clearly, the feeling of standing in front of the big door of American sports history without a key. He was praised, but not guaranteed, loved, but not recognized on equal terms. Success came fast, brilliant, and full of emotion, but it always carried the shadow of impermanence. That was the subtle tragedy of the pioneer. You go first, but no one walks with you. You blaze the trail, but you're not necessarily invited into the house that trail leads to. Julius played in that state of contradiction throughout his ABA years, enjoying a freedom he'd never had before, while understanding that this freedom existed because he was on the edge of the system. He didn't voice it, because from childhood he was used to not complaining, but deep down, the feeling of not enough returned, like a familiar echo from his childhood. Every dunk made the crowd explode, but after the cheers came the silence of debates where people still viewed the NBA as the only true standard. Julius stood on the court, called the best, but at the same time he knew he was playing in a world that history could erase at any moment. The ABA gave him space to become himself, but it also placed him in a fragile position, where every glory could be erased if the league didn't last. Julius's loneliness wasn't about lacking people around him. It was about not knowing where he belonged in the larger order of American basketball. He was no longer the invisible boy, but he wasn't yet part of the mainstream story either. He flew between two worlds, never fully touching either one. To many that was Dr. J's most beautiful era, where creativity was completely unleashed. But for Julius, it was also an era of prolonged suspension. Every time he left the court to applause, he carried the feeling that he was still standing outside a door that hadn't opened yet. Success didn't bring peace of mind, because it didn't come with the assurance that what he did would be remembered in the right place. The tragedy of the pioneer isn't total rejection, it's recognition that's incomplete. Julius Erving became the face of the ABA, the soul of a league, but he was also tied to a label he couldn't control: talent on the margins. That quietly wore him down, not with sharp pain but with prolonged doubt. He kept playing, kept flying, kept giving, because that was the only way he knew to survive. But deep in his heart, Julius understood that if the ABA ever disappeared one day, everything he'd done could be seen as a footnote in history. And it was that very fear of not belonging anywhere that prepared him for an even harsher next phase, the moment he was forced to step through the NBA's main door, no longer as a free artist, but as someone ready to trade parts of himself just to stay. When the ABA and NBA officially merged, that moment was recorded in American basketball history as an inevitable step forward. But for Julius Erving, it was the point when he realized that all the glory he'd ever had could be called into question again. The world he was about to enter was no longer a place that encouraged difference. It was a power structure that had long defined the standards. There, No one cared how high he'd flown in the ABA, no one rushed to admit that what he did had changed the way people looked at basketball. He entered the NBA not as a legend, but as someone who had to prove himself all over again. Someone with a reputation but no final stamp of approval. Skeptical looks appeared right from the early days, not loud, but cold enough to remind him that this wasn't the stage where he could be fully himself. Julius quickly realized that the NBA didn't need a free artist. They needed a player who knew how to conform, who knew how to blend into the system, who knew how to sacrifice instinct to serve the existing order. The flights that once made ABA crowds stand up were now scrutinized as unnecessary showboating. His unique moves were questioned for efficiency, and gradually, the message became clear even if no one said it outright. If he wanted to stay, he had to fly less, be less different, be less like the Julius Erving of yesterday. For someone who had long been used to not complaining, Julius didn't protest publicly. He listened, observed, and made the most painful decision of his career to cut away a part of himself. Not because he believed he was wrong, but because he understood that if he didn't accept the change, this door would close forever. He began adjusting his game, reducing the risky aerial plays, focusing more on discipline, on reading the game, on the stability the NBA valued. Every time he chose the safe option, instead of soaring, it wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a cut into the identity he had nurtured since his early days in Roosevelt. No one saw that trade-off, because on the stat sheet, Julius still played well, still contributed, still was a star, but inside, he knew he was leaving behind a piece of freedom he could never fully reclaim. Entering the NBA didn't bring an instant sense of victory, it felt more like a prolonged negotiation with himself. Julius couldn't afford to fail, because every mistake would be taken as proof that he was just a product of a fringe league. That pressure turned every game into a silent test. He had to prove he wasn't just the guy who could fly, he could survive in a much harsher system. And he did it, but the price wasn't light. The calm the public admired was really the result of prolonged self-restraint. Julius learned to hide regret, learned to smile when he knew there were moments that could have been different if he hadn't bowed to the new standards. Glory in the NBA came slower, heavier, and less pure than in the ABA years. It was no longer the natural explosion of talent, it was the fruit of discipline and sacrifice. Every time he was recognized, Julius understood that recognition was bought by accepting to shrink himself. That was the bitter paradox of this phase. To stay in the center, he had to give up part of the soul that had brought him there. But Julius didn't turn back. He never allowed himself to look too long at what was lost, because from childhood he had learned that regret doesn't help survival. He kept moving forward, carrying the fragments of his old identity like a burden he couldn't put down. To the public, this was the journey of a superstar maturing. To Julius, it was the journey of accepting that glory sometimes doesn't begin with transcendence, but with painful trade-offs, where you have to learn to exist in a world not built to embrace your difference. When Julius Erving arrived in Philadelphia, he was no longer a man looking for a place to stand. He was the man expected to give meaning to a team that always stood on the edge of greatness, but had never reached the top. The city didn't need a flying artist, they needed a leader. And Julius, with instincts honed through years of self-restraint, understood that difference very clearly. With the Philadelphia 76ers, he didn't talk much, didn't impose, didn't use words to control the locker room. His presence alone was heavy enough to create order. Teammates watched how he practiced, how he disciplined himself, how he accepted pain without complaint, and they knew this was someone they could trust in the toughest moments. Julius became the moral center of the team, a leader who didn't need slogans. Those years in Philadelphia brought him to the peak that the NBA could finally no longer deny. The 1983 season ended with a championship, and in that moment, all doubts about his ABA past seemed to vanish. Julius stood at the top of the basketball world, with the title people once said he needed to complete his legacy. The whole city celebrated, history was rewritten, and his name was placed alongside the most mainstream legends of the NBA. But even amid the cheers, a quiet truth remained. Victory didn't bring the liberation many imagined. The championship didn't make the years of shrinking himself disappear. It didn't return the freedom that had been cut away when he learned to survive in the system. It also didn't reach the child inside him, the child who grew up in absence, and learned not to expect the world to hold him up. Julius was respected absolutely, but that respect was external. It acknowledged him as a player, a leader, an icon, but it never touched the voids that had formed long ago. When the arena lights went out, when the cheers gave way to the quiet of long evenings, Julius was still the man accustomed to facing himself in silence. Success didn't make him happier in a simple way, because he had never made happiness the measure of existence. He placed duty above emotion, and victory, no matter how brilliant, was just part of that duty. To the public, the 1983 championship was the final affirmation that Dr. J belonged at the NBA's peak. To Julius, it was confirmation that his sacrifices weren't meaningless, but it wasn't the answer to every question in his heart. He had reached the peak of his career, but that peak didn't bring peace. It didn't erase the memory of years spent proving he was worthy enough, didn't soothe the feeling that he always had to be stronger than necessary to be accepted. Julius kept playing, kept leading, kept maintaining the calm image America loved. But behind that image was a man far too accustomed to never allowing himself to collapse. Philadelphia gave him the title history demanded, but it didn't give him a new life. Success didn't heal the child who learned to be silent to survive. It only draped that child in a robe of glory, heavier and brighter, but still not enough to cover the cracks inside. The peak of Julius Erving's career was the moment the entire system recognized him, but it was also the moment he realized that some voids can't be filled with victories. He had gone farther than anyone from the ABA ever had, achieved what many said was necessary to become a complete legend, but being complete by history's standards didn't mean complete in his inner life. Julius never spoke about it, because he never had the habit of talking about what he lacked. He kept walking, carrying the title, the respect, and a quiet emptiness that no one in the stands could see. The peak in Philadelphia closed a chapter of controversy, but at the same time opened a harder-to-accept truth, that some people achieve everything they ever strived for, yet still have to live with parts of life that will never heal. And it was in that very paradox that Julius Erving kept moving forward, no longer seeking recognition, just continuing to exist as a man who had fulfilled his role on the court, but who had never stopped carrying what the court could never resolve. After the peak in Philadelphia, when the titles had been etched into history, and respect no longer had to be fought for, Julius Erving began stepping into a different phase of life, where the opponents no longer wore jerseys, no longer appeared on play sheets, but lived right inside his own body. There was no dramatic collapse, no crack that silenced the entire arena, just nameless pains showing up more and more often, quietly but persistently, like a reminder that every leap had to be paid for. His knees started speaking up after workouts that seemed harmless. His back ached every time he sat down and stood up. His hips felt weary, as if they'd carried too many seasons without ever getting full rest. These weren't the kind of injuries that made headlines, not dramatic enough to make people stop and applaud a farewell. They were the slow destruction of a body that had lived too long in a state of pushing limits. Julius realized the scariest thing wasn't the pain itself, but how familiar it became. It didn't arrive like a clear enemy, but like an uninvited guest that showed up every day, taking up space in his life, and forcing him to adjust every small movement. For someone so used to living by discipline, Julius didn't complain, didn't seek pity. He kept training, kept playing, kept holding the calm demeanor the public expected, but every run now had to be calculated. Every jump carried the question of whether his body would answer tomorrow. The legs that once lifted him into the air now began pulling him back to the ground, not through sudden betrayal, but through an increasingly clear refusal. Julius understood early that this body would never give back what it had taken. The years of soaring, the imperfect landings, the collisions swallowed in the roar of crowds had accumulated into a debt that couldn't be erased. He wasn't angry, because anger didn't ease the pain. He didn't dwell too much in nostalgia either, because nostalgia only made the gap between past and present more cruel. Instead, Julius learned acceptance, a cold but necessary acceptance, much like the way he once accepted shrinking himself when entering the NBA. This wasn't a phase of glorious moments. It was a phase of mornings waking up with a stiff body, of evenings having to lie still more than he wanted, of new limits imposed without permission. The public still saw Dr. J with his calm smile, with the familiar confident posture, but no one saw the silent negotiation between him and his own body. Every day he had to decide how far to push, how much to endure, and when to stop before the price became unacceptable. That was a different kind of discipline, not glamorous, not celebrated, but no less harsh than any season he'd played. Julius no longer flew, and that wasn't just a physical change, it was a profound shift in identity. The man who once defined himself through the air now had to learn to live fully on the ground. That transition didn't happen overnight, it stretched out, smoldering, forcing him to face a question he'd once avoided: if I can no longer do what I did best, who am I? For many people, that question leads to crisis. For Julius, it led to deeper silence. He didn't try to fill the void with words or constant public appearances. He withdrew inward, focused on keeping his body stable enough to keep living on his own rhythm. The pains became part of everyday life, not events anymore, but background. And in that background, Julius continued to exist with the dignity that had followed him since the beginning. There was no explosive tragedy for the audience to cry over, just a dry truth. Greatness doesn't end when the career closes, it continues in another way through accepting what can't be reversed. The legs no longer flew, but they still walked, slower, heavier, carrying the entire history of everything that had happened. Julius Erving didn't blame his body, because he understood it had given him everything it could, but he also didn't fool himself into thinking he could reclaim the past. In that slow destruction, he learned a brutal but honest lesson. Every moment of soaring leaves a mark, and when time comes to collect, no negotiation is big enough to keep what's been lost. The only thing left is how a person faces that truth, and Julius chose to face it the way he always had, quietly, resiliently, and without letting the pain define his entire being, even though it was present in every step. After his body started speaking up and new limits were set without his permission, Julius Erving stepped into another region of life, one without stands, without scoreboards, and without a final buzzer to signal when everything was considered enough. That was family. If the court was where he learned to endure physical pain in silence, then family was where he had to confront a different kind of pain, more silent, harder to name, and impossible to train away. Fame brought Julius near absolute respect in the outside world, but that very fame also placed a persistent, long-lasting pressure on his marriage, not exploding into scandal, but heavy enough to crack things that seemed solid. The schedule, the constant travel, the back-to-back seasons made his presence in family life fragmented. Julius wasn't irresponsible, wasn't someone who ran from duty, but he had grown used to putting work above emotion, used to thinking that fulfilling the outside role also meant fulfilling the inside one. In his world, responsibility was often measured by stability, by not letting things collapse, by making sure the family didn't go without. But some things can't be compensated with stability, and some voids can't be filled with fame or respect. Being a father in Julius's life always went hand in hand with unintentional absence. He loved his children, but he wasn't always there when they needed him. He was present for the big moments, but he missed countless small ones, the things that create the feeling of being seen and held. There was no scandal for the press to dig into, no dramatic story for history to remember, just the slow erosion of relationships that had to adapt to a man constantly pulled toward the public. Julius didn't make excuses for it, nor did he deny it. He understood that the choices that brought him to legendary status were the same choices that took away wholeness in family life. And the most painful thing wasn't being criticized, it was realizing he had done everything right by society's standards, yet still left wounds those standards didn't account for. In the rare evenings at home, when silence filled the space, Julius faced a feeling familiar from childhood, the feeling of being close to others yet separated by an invisible distance. He wasn't good at saying soft things, wasn't used to admitting he needed to be with someone in a way not tied to roles or duties. The years of learning not to need anyone had helped him survive, but they also made it hard to open up once his career had shaped who he was. His family loved him, but they loved a man forged to endure more than to share. Julius tried to make up for it with presence when he could, with concrete actions, with keeping promises in the things he could control. But some hurts fell outside that control. Some distances formed not from lack of love, but from lack of time and emotional presence. He wasn't an absent man out of selfishness. He was a man accustomed to sacrificing himself for a bigger goal, and he didn't realize that sacrifice could also wound the people closest to him. Looking back, Julius didn't blame himself dramatically. He understood that every path has its own price, and the path he chose demanded a level of hardness not every family could withstand. But understanding didn't mean it didn't hurt. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to slow down, memories of the times he wasn't there, the times he arrived late, the times he had to leave early came back like small scratches, not deep enough to bleed, but enough to remind him they never fully go away. Family was the place where Julius couldn't win with discipline, couldn't compensate with achievements, and couldn't soothe everything with silence. There, he was just a man trying to do his best in a role he was never fully prepared for. The people closest to him were sometimes the farthest away, not because of a lack of love, but because life forced each person to adapt in different ways. Julius Erving moved through this phase not with showy guilt, but with a heavy awareness that greatness in the public eye is often built on private trade-offs. He continued carrying his responsibilities, continued trying to be present when he could, but he didn't fool himself into thinking every distance could be leveled. In the silence of family, there were no cheers, no titles, just a man who understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who bear the most from the choices that made your legend. In the year 2000, Julius Erving's life reached a depth no court, no professional failure, no physical injury had ever prepared him to face. It wasn't a fall he could rise from with willpower, not a bad season that could be fixed with discipline. It was the moment a father lost his son. Julius Erving III passed away, and with that, the entire mental structure Julius had built his whole life quietly collapsed. There was no roar of the crowd, no arena lights, no moment to take a deep breath and keep going. Just absolute, cold, nameless emptiness. Julius had lived his entire life believing that if he was disciplined enough, controlled enough, strong enough, a person could overcome anything. But in the face of his son's death, all of that became meaningless. There was no lesson to draw, no higher meaning to cling to, no inspiring story to retell. Just a father standing before the cruelest truth: some losses cannot be prevented, and some pains no title can shield you from. Julius didn't talk much about that pain, because language had never been enough to hold it. The silence that enveloped him was no longer the familiar calm, it was a state of paralysis. The habits that had helped him survive for decades no longer worked. Discipline didn't ease the pain. Control didn't stop the memories from flooding back. Dignity didn't help him sleep at night. The man who once owned the air, who once dictated the rhythm of an entire game, now stood helpless before mornings when he woke up feeling something had been taken away forever. He had once believed his role was to protect, to be a pillar, to keep everything from falling apart, but his son's death exposed a limit he had never touched. Some things lie beyond any father's protection, no matter how strong that father is. Julius's collapse wasn't loud. It didn't happen in public, wasn't captured in images, wasn't retold in epic stories. It happened in private moments, where he faced himself without the familiar armor. Long nights passed in heavy silence, where memories of his son surfaced without order, without logic, just as sharp fragments. Julius didn't try to escape that pain, but he also didn't know how to live with it. He was used to overcoming adversity through action, but this time no action was big enough to make a difference. Every survival strategy that had once made him successful was powerless. Pain isn't something you can train to endure better. It doesn't fade linearly over time. It changes, settles, then surges unexpectedly in moments without warning. Julius understood that from then on his life would always carry an unhealable crack, not a wound to display, not a tragedy to recount, but a quiet void that accompanied him in every decision, every breath. He was no longer the man who believed he could control everything with toughness. His son's death forced him to confront his own fragility, the reality that some pains cannot be overcome, they can only be carried, to the public. Julius Erving remained the icon of calm and dignity, but behind that image was a father who had lost the most precious thing, with no chance to fix or make up for it. He didn't seek pity, nor did he allow himself to collapse completely, but from that moment, everything he did carried a different weight. His silence was no longer a sign of strength, it was the trace of a pain without language. Julius continued to live, continued to appear, continued to fulfill his role in the basketball world and beyond. But deep inside, he knew a part of him had stayed forever in that moment in the year 2000. The man who once ruled the court, once looked up to by millions, now had to accept a brutal truth: he could not protect his son from fate, and no lesson, no philosophy, no inspiring story could soften that. That pain didn't need explanation, because it existed beyond any framework of explanation. It simply was, like a silent but persistent entity, reminding that behind every legend is a human being, and behind every human being are losses that never heal. After his son's death, Julius Erving didn't step into the light to tell his story. He didn't choose the path many take when tragedy strikes, sharing, explaining, turning pain into part of the public image. Instead, Julius withdrew, not out of shame, not out of lack of courage, but because he understood that some losses cannot withstand the gaze of the crowd. Silence for him was no longer the habit of a calm man, it became the only way to keep living without breaking. The media waited for a statement, an interview, a human moment so the audience could empathize. But Julius didn't give them that. He didn't want his son's death to become a story to be consumed, commented on, dissected like so many other events in his life. He didn't tell, because he knew no telling could be honest. Every word would shrink the pain, make it neater than it really was. And Julius refused that reduction. He chose to disappear from public conversations, gradually reduce appearances, keep distance from places once familiar, not because he turned his back on the world, but because the world couldn't give him what he needed right then: absolute quiet. In that silence, Julius didn't seek healing in the usual sense. He didn't believe this pain could be processed, overcome, or transformed. He only learned to carry it with him, like a fixed weight, not growing heavier, but never lighter. Choosing not to use the pain for sympathy was a hard decision, because it meant not receiving the support the public was ready to offer. But Julius didn't want that sympathy. He didn't want other people's eyes to decide the shape of his pain. He didn't want to be asked questions without answers, nor did he want to pretend to be stronger than he could be, so he chose the solitary path, the path he had known since very early in life. Julius' silence after the tragedy wasn't avoidance, it was a form of protection, protecting his son's memory from the intrusion of the outside world, protecting himself from having to explain the unexplainable. He continued living, continued fulfilling the minimum responsibilities, but withdrew from roles that no longer held meaning. Ceremonies, invitations, opportunities to appear in public became fewer, not because he was no longer welcome, but because he no longer wanted to enter spaces where his pain could be misunderstood. Julius understood that if he spoke, people would listen, but they would listen on their terms, not his. And for a man trying to hold on to the remaining pieces of himself, that was unacceptable. Silence became a new discipline, no less harsh than any phase of his career. Not the discipline of training, but the discipline of not letting emotion spill when it wasn't ready. Julius didn't seek salvation, nor did he expect time to make everything better. He only tried to keep himself from collapsing completely, day by day. Those closest to him understood this wasn't coldness, it was the only way he knew to survive. He didn't demand that others understand, nor did he explain his choice. He just slowed down, drew inward, and accepted that from then on, life would always have a dark corner that would never be lit. In that silence, Julius didn't become weaker, but he was no longer the man of the old standards. He learned to live with the pain without needing to name it. He learned to wake up each morning without seeking any grand meaning, just to keep going, and perhaps that was the bravest thing he ever did. No victory, no declaration, no external acknowledgement, just a father choosing to carry the pain alone, because he knew some losses don't need to be witnessed to be real. Silence in Julius Erving's case wasn't absence, it was the only space wide enough for that pain to exist without being distorted. While the NBA continued to run like a machine that never stops, Julius Erving stepped into a different rhythm of life, slower, quieter, heavier. The basketball world didn't forget him. On the contrary, it kept honoring him. Ceremonies, tribute videos, Articles praising his legacy appeared regularly, as if history was dutifully doing its job. His jersey was raised, his name invoked in debates about the greatest ever, and the image of Dr. J lived on in collective memory as the symbol of a beautiful era. New generations grew up with old footage, learning to fly through screens, admiring the calm demeanor and elegance he once brought to the sport. To them, Julius Erving was a complete legend, a story neatly closed, but precisely in that completeness, a bitter paradox emerged. History moved on, neatly arranged, retold with clear highlights. Julius did not. He stayed, trapped in a moment that time didn't blur. His evenings had no audience, no applause, no one witnessing the silent dialogue between him and memory. People could speak of his legacy with excitement, but no one was in the nights with him. No one saw how the loss seeped into every quiet space. The NBA's honors were public. Julius's pain was utterly private. Those two worlds existed side by side, never touching. Every time he appeared at an event, smiled, shook hands, accepted thanks, he fulfilled his role perfectly. But when the door closed, when the lights went out, he returned to a reality not written in any article. New generations could see him as an immortal icon, but they didn't carry the unanswered questions he faced every day. They couldn't feel the void that a name mentioned in history books couldn't fill. Julius understood that difference very clearly, and he didn't resent it. He never demanded the world stop for his pain. He accepted that history has its own pace, and that pace waits for no one. But that acceptance didn't bring relief. It only confirmed a cold truth. The world moves on, and he cannot. The rituals of honor, no matter how grand, never reached the deepest part of him. They acknowledged what he had done, but didn't know what to do with what he had lost. Julius stood on the boundary between two roles, both a historical figure and a man living in the present with memories that refused to rest. He fulfilled his duty to history, but history had no duty to hold him up. And in that misalignment he continued to exist, not as someone forgotten, but as someone who had accepted that no one could step into his pain in his place. The basketball world kept producing new stars, new moments, new stories, new names were chanted, new legs soared through the air, and every time he saw that, Julius didn't feel envy, nor did he reminisce in a sentimental way. He just quietly realized that his time had truly stayed behind. Not because he was forgotten, but because he no longer moved with the current. History had finished its work with him, but life kept presenting long evenings where there was nothing to honor, nothing to celebrate, just a man sitting with losses that couldn't be shared. And in that silence, Julius Erving continued to hold the dignity that had followed him his whole life. He didn't demand to be understood, nor did he seek to be remembered differently. He let the world move on, because that's what it always does. And he stayed, not to cling to the past, but to live with it, in a space where history doesn't enter, and where no cheer is loud enough to drown out a pain that has become a permanent part of who he is. As he entered old age, Julius Erving didn't face any new tragedy big enough to make the world turn its head. No accident, no sudden collapse, no dramatic moment people would call a turning point, just the old pains that refused to go away. They were there, steady, persistent, like unwanted companions who had followed him for years, and now had no reason to leave. The body that once flew now moved slowly, every step carrying a deliberation youth never had to think about. No more natural flexibility, no more instant reflexes. Every movement needed preparation. Every morning began by listening to see how far his body would allow him to go that day. It wasn't sharp, intense pain. It was a dull, constant weariness, enough to remind him that no reward is free, and no wound heals on its own just because enough time has passed. Julius didn't complain about it. He had long grown used to accepting what couldn't be changed, but that acceptance didn't make the days any lighter. His old age didn't look like full rest. It resembled a repeating sequence of days, where each morning replayed the one before, and each evening closed with the same familiar emptiness. Memories, unlike the body, didn't slow down. They appeared without schedule, without invitation. Some days memories of soaring on the court came back so vividly, he could almost feel the air beneath his feet again. But other days, memories of private losses filled every space, heavier than any physical pain. Julius didn't try to chase them away. He understood that memories are the final price of having lived fully, but understanding didn't mean not being hurt by them. Each passing day felt like a reminder, not of glory, but of the reality that some things would stay with him until the end without ever being fixed. No new climax to overcome, no big challenge to prove his resilience. Just the necessary patience to keep existing in a body that no longer responded like before, and in a mind that already carried too much to set down. Julius slowed down, not by choice, but because his body forced him to. Workouts were replaced by gentle movements, meetings became rarer, and time alone stretched longer. In that time, he didn't seek distraction through noisy activities. He let things happen as they were, without embellishment, without avoidance. Old age for him wasn't a new chapter full of hope, it was the honest continuation of all the chapters before. What hadn't healed wouldn't magically disappear just because his hair had turned gray. It only changed shape, sank deeper, and became the background of everyday life. Julius didn't live in pessimism, but he also didn't live in illusion. He understood that waking up each day was already a small victory, one that didn't need recognition. He no longer measured life by what he could still do, but by what he still had the strength to endure. And in that endurance, there was no epic, no praise, just a man who had gone through nearly every shade of public life, and now faced the harshest private part. Julius Erving's old age wasn't marked by new tragedy, because the greatest tragedy had already happened, and didn't need repeating. It was marked by persistence, by continuing each day to live with things that would never heal, not trying to turn them into lessons, not forcing them to carry noble meaning. He just let them be there, as part of who he was. And perhaps that very honesty was the hardest thing, accepting that some wounds aren't meant to be overcome, but to be carried quietly, until there's nothing left to carry. In this phase of life, Julius Erving existed in a parallel state that few people truly understood fully. To the public, he remained an icon, a beloved legend, spoken of with respect, tied to immortal footage and beautiful collective memories. In their eyes, Julius Erving embodied elegance, a basketball era where talent and dignity could walk hand in hand. That icon stood firm, untouched by time, unshaken by private pains. But on the other side of that door was family, where no icon could last long. There Julius wasn't Dr. J wasn't the legend, he was a flesh-and-blood man, carrying fatigue, long silences, and losses that never got shouted out loud. His family saw him in slow mornings, in prolonged quiet moments, in times when his gaze drifted far beyond the room. They didn't see the flights, they saw the weight those flights left behind. Julius carried both roles at once, and neither was lighter than the other. The icon demanded he maintain the image, appear appropriately, represent a legacy that couldn't be allowed to crack. The man demanded he face what couldn't be fixed, live with emotions that had no place in tribute ceremonies. Those two roles didn't cancel each other out, but they didn't merge into one either. They existed side by side, pulling him in different directions, making every step carry a quiet tension. Julius didn't seek salvation from history. He didn't believe that being remembered, ranked or named in greatness debates, could give him back what he had lost. History, to him, was just a cold record of what happened on the court. It had no power to comfort, no obligation to heal. Julius understood that early on, and it became clearer with time. He didn't live waiting for history to grant him new meaning, because he was too familiar with the fact that the greatest meaning in his life lay in things history couldn't record. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to look back, Julius didn't ask whether he had been judged fairly. He asked whether he had lived honestly enough with what he had and what he couldn't keep. That question had no clear answer, and he didn't force it to have one. Liberation, if it existed, had never been his goal. He didn't try to lighten himself by reliving old victories, or by letting the public keep loving him in familiar ways. He accepted that some people are loved deeply, but not set free. Julius Erving was one of them. Being loved was a privilege, but it didn't erase what had happened in his private life. It didn't replace what was lost, and it didn't make the present days any easier. His family understood that more clearly than anyone, because they didn't see him through the lens of the icon. They saw the quiet resilience, the unshown fatigue, and a man who had spent his life carrying more than others could see. Julius continued carrying both roles, without trying to escape either one, without hoping either one would save him. He let the icon exist for the world, and the man exist for his family. Both were him, and both demanded enduring persistence. There was no moment of unification, no endpoint where everything was fully explained, just a legend widely loved, and a man still living with what could never be removed. And in that parallel existence, Julius Erving kept walking, not lighter, not heavier, just honest with the reality that the world's love and inner peace don't always go together. If you had to talk about the real legacy of Julius Erving, it wouldn't be the trophies, it wouldn't be the numbers etched on stat sheets, and it wouldn't be the clips replayed every time people want to recall a glorious era. Those things exist, carefully preserved, properly honored, but Julius's true legacy lies in what he lost along the way to creating all of that. It lies in the parts of his body that are no longer whole, in mornings that must begin with caution, in pains not intense enough to draw attention, but persistent enough to never leave. It lies in the parts of his soul worn down too early, by discipline, by prolonged self-restraint, by the habit of never allowing himself weakness, even when no one demanded it anymore. Julius didn't define his career by titles, because titles come and go, are awarded and then stored in museums. He defined it by what couldn't be stored away, the marks that followed him to the end of his life. Every flight that once left crowds, breathless, left behind a silent debt. Every extended season took away a little more recovery ability, and every time he chose to keep going instead of stopping, was one more time he accepted trading the future to complete the present. Julius's greatness wasn't in how much he achieved, but in how much he paid to achieve it. Few saw that price while the lights were still on. Few understood that the calm demeanor the public loved wasn't a sign of an easy life, but the result of a long process of learning to endure without complaint. Julius learned to stand tall when his body wanted to collapse, learned to smile when there was no inner reason to smile, and learned to keep walking when everything inside was already exhausted. His true legacy therefore isn't about victory, it's about sacrifice. It doesn't encourage others to dream, it forces people to face the truth that to create something beautiful for the world, sometimes a person has to accept never being whole again for themselves. Julius didn't tell that story with words. He let it show in his slow walk, in the careful way he stood up or sat down, in the silences that lasted longer than necessary. He didn't try to turn loss into a noble message, because he understood that loss doesn't need to be rationalized to be real, it just needs to be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement, for Julius, happened in silence. When people talk about his influence on basketball, they often mention the next generation, the players who learned to fly because of him. But few ask what Julius had to give up to teach the world that lesson. Few ask whether he still had enough strength left to enjoy the legacy he created. Greatness in Julius Erving's case wasn't a final gift handed over at the end. It was a prolonged process where every step forward came with a piece of depletion, and when that process ended, what remained wasn't a sense of triumph, but a quiet acceptance that there was no other path. Julius wasn't proud in a showy way, nor regretful in a sentimental way. He stood in the middle, where clarity allowed him to look straight at the price he paid without needing to justify it. His true legacy therefore doesn't need flowery praise. It exists as a quiet reminder that greatness, if it exists, always comes with loss. And sometimes what deserves the most respect isn't what a person achieved, but what they lost and still kept living, kept holding dignity, and kept not demanding the world understand everything. Julius Erving left basketball a new kind of beauty, but he also left himself a life that would never be completely whole again. That is the real legacy, not glamorous, not easy to retell, but heartbreakingly honest. At age 75, Julius Erving no longer stands under the lights, no longer hears opening music, no longer has any moment that forces the world to hold its breath, waiting for him to soar. Mornings arrive slowly, evenings arrive early, and the days pass without climax. No one consoles him with empty words, because he doesn't seek them either. In front of him there is no longer a court, just the steady rhythm of a man who has gone as far as talent could take him. His body reminds him with familiar limits, His memories remind him with voids that never close, and in all of that, there is nothing resembling the peace people imagine will come after all the glory has been handed out. Julius didn't find peace. He learned to live without it. That isn't surrender. It's a harsh form of acceptance, forged through decades of facing what cannot be fixed. He doesn't wake up each day feeling serene. He wakes up with the clarity of a man who knows exactly how far he can go today, how much he can endure, and where to stop so things don't get worse. Evenings don't end with applause. They end in silence wide enough for memories to find their own way back. Some memories are beautiful, the flights that once made an entire generation believe humans could defy gravity. But others are heavy, without images, without sound, just the feeling of loss existing as an inseparable part. Julius doesn't chase them away, nor does he let them swallow him. He lets them be there, coexisting, the way he learned very early in life. No lights means no place to hide. No consolation means no outside support. Just one man facing himself, with everything he achieved and everything he lost. Julius paid the full price for greatness, not just with sweat and time, but with parts of life that could never be restored. He paid with a worn-down body, with relationships under constant pressure, with a private pain beyond any public measure. And he keeps living, not because he hopes one day everything will balance out, but because life itself demands to be continued, no matter the form. If there is anything like serenity at this age, it isn't joy, it's honesty. Julius doesn't fool himself into thinking everything is okay. He also doesn't allow himself to sink into bitterness. He stands in the middle, where a man looks straight at his life, without editing the story, to make it easier to hear. He doesn't need history to write him an extra chapter of redemption. He doesn't need the public to love him in a new way. He just needs enough strength to keep existing with what he has, and with what he'll never have again. Looking back, Julius doesn't count what he achieved. He understands that list has long been made by others for him. What he carries is a deep understanding that greatness isn't a final state, it's a process that leaves marks. Those marks don't disappear when the career ends. They stay in every cautious step, in every prolonged silence, in every evening no one witnesses. And perhaps that's where the real Julius Erving appears most clearly. Not Dr. J of the flights, but the man who landed and kept living with whatever remained after that landing. This story doesn't seek a final victory. It doesn't try to close with comfort. It stops at a simple and crueler truth. Some people never find peace, but still learn to live without it. For American audiences, Julius Erving's legacy isn't just in how he changed the sport, but in how he accepted the price of that change without demanding extra reward. Some men are remembered for how high they flew, others for how much they lost after landing. The story of Julius Erving leaves behind a quiet but deep sadness, because this isn't the tragedy of a man who failed, it's the tragedy of a man who went to the very end of glory, and still had to pay for it until the last day. Throughout the story, we see the central paradox clearly: a man who once flew higher than anyone, who was once celebrated by all of America, but who grew up in emotional absence, learned silence to survive, and was never truly healed. From the boy in Roosevelt, who lost his father too soon, to the pioneer isolated in the ABA, to an NBA star forced to shrink himself to be accepted, Julius Erving always won by sacrificing. The Philadelphia peak in 1983 didn't erase the child inside him. His worn body didn't come with a dramatic breaking moment, and especially his son's death in the year 2000 shattered every layer of discipline, control and dignity he had ever built. His choice to stay silent, to withdraw from the media, to not use the pain for sympathy shows a rare character, enduring without turning loss into a tool. Julius's old age has no new tragedy, just the repetition of old pains, unsoothed memories, and a life continuing in the absence of inner peace. For the American people, the lesson here isn't reach for greatness at any cost, but to look straight at the price of greatness. Success doesn't automatically bring peace, history doesn't heal, and some pains can't be overcome, they can only be lived with. Julius Erving taught us that true dignity isn't in the final victory, but in how a man keeps living when there's nothing left to win. If the story of Julius Erving made you pause and see the price of greatness differently, please hit subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the fates behind the spotlight. Thank you for staying until this very moment, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor not just the legends, but also the silent losses that made them who they were.